Good morning. I like it. All right. Welcome to Leveraging Public Opinion to Drive Education Policy. I'm Catherine Bathgate. I'm the CEO and co-founder of School Forward, and I'll be your moderator today. Before I introduce our awesome speakers next to me, I'd like to start with a quick story. So back in 2002, there was this company founded, and the purpose of their service was to provide a particular service via mail. And they managed it all right, but they were up against a very large company with thousands of stores. Despite that, they reached a valuation of about $300 million. But then about 5 years later, in 2007, they did something that changed everything. They decided to offer a new way of accessing movies and TV shows more immediately, one that had never been done before, and would completely change the way we consume entertainment. Today, they're the standard in online content delivery, and Netflix never touches a DVD or a stamp. Their total valuation is around $350 billion right now, a 100x increase of where they started in 2002. But where did they get the idea to make that shift? It actually came directly from the customers themselves. They decided to listen to the customers, and in doing that, they learned that customers wanted to be able to consume content right away, on demand, whenever and wherever they were. Listening to the customer was the inspiration and key to Netflix's success. So today, we're going to get a chance to listen to the customers of education, the parents, the students, the voters, and it turns out that they have some pretty clear ideas and opinions about what the biggest challenges are in K-12 education and the solutions that they want to see. And I think that if we take the time to listen to them, it will help us focus our policy work and our efforts and potentially change the way that we approach education policy and the framing and the messaging around it. So Brian Stryker here is the managing partner at Impact Research and a leading Democrat pollster, and Robert Blizzard is the founder of Up One Insights and a leading Republican pollster. And together, these two, with the support of the Walton Family Foundation over the past few years, have conducted some excellent research on what voters and parents want when it comes to K through 12. And what's great about this research is not only do we get to see a snapshot of where voters and parents are right now, but we also get to look back at where they were a couple of years ago and see how those trends are evolving and changing. So with that, Brian and Robert, take it away.
All right. Thank you for having us. We're going to walk through a national survey that we conducted, Brian Schopp and my firm, a couple months ago, looking at voters and parents. Pretty robust national sample of 2,000 registered voters, and we also did an oversample of parents because we wanted to see if there were obviously any key differences between where voters and parents were on a number of topics or issues. This is why I hate these mics. Yeah, there we go. All right. Let's start off with the problem. So first and foremost, we are in a different political environment, different economic environment, different issue environment, different landscape in general from where we were 2 years ago when we did that polling that Catherine talked about after the 2022 midterms. That being said, a lot of the data we found in this survey demonstrates a lot of similar trends to what we saw a couple years ago. I think number one, might be tough for folks to read in the back, but essentially, we gave voters kind of a potential laundry list of problems and concerns and asked voters and parents to point to essentially what did they find to be the biggest concerns, the biggest problems facing public schools today. Obviously, as you see kind of laid out there at the top, funding. Funding continues to be a concern that is really hasn't gone away from voters or parents over the last decade plus. Continues to be a significant concern. But then there's also some concerns underneath the top there, specifically on lack of parental involvement among voters, specifically among the lack of quality curriculum. And you can see how far down it goes to a number of different issues. Parents in particular, which we thought was found to be kind of interesting and a little bit of a change from where we were a few years ago, is more of a focus on mental health, and that mental health services right now are from schools are poor. And we have some other data in this survey that we'll talk about, that demonstrates that as well. But a lot of concerns from voters, a lot of sense that things are still kind of off on the wrong track overall in terms of the direction of public schools, and in what voters or parents are talking about. They want better teachers, they want more funding, they want better curriculum, they want. There's a lot of desires that voters and parents have for public schools. One of the most interesting data points in the poll that we found was this overarching thing that I know Brian and I saw a couple of years ago in other research we've done in states and across the country, where there's certainly a sense that students are worse off than they were generations ago. Number one, when it comes to reading, 61% of all voters think that we are worse off in terms of reading from where we were a few years ago. Very similar numbers you see among parents there as well. So there's this kind of pessimism about the current direction of where reading curriculum is, especially compared to where things were in previous generations. That being said, parents aren't so sure their kids are having problems. So when we ask this question, do you think your student, your child, and this is asked just among parents, do you think your kids' reading skills are at or above grade level or below grade level? You can see here that almost 8 out of 10, when you add up the red bar, which is 41%, and the blue bar, which is 41% of it above level, or at level, you have 8 out of 10 voters, or parents, that is, who say that their kids are reading at grade level. We know from testing, and this, of course, demonstrates the importance of testing, which we've seen voters continue to place high importance on over the years, to show that that's obviously not the case, specifically when you look at where this stands in terms of where current test scores show kids are on reading. This is not specific just to reading. We also see the same thing when it comes to math. A lot of concern about where students are these days when it comes to math. Most believe kids are worse off than previous generations. Again, more than 6 out of 10 voters believe that kids are worse off, and almost 6 out of 10 parents believe kids are worse off when it comes to math. Again, similar trends. Again, almost 8 out of 10 voters, when you add the red and the dark kind of Duke blue bar, if you will, there, as opposed to the North Carolina blue bar, together, you have about 8 out of 10 who say that their kids are at or above grade level when it comes to math. And as we know, that's certainly not the case from test results that we've seen across the country. You want to talk a little bit about this, Catherine?
Yeah, I'll chime in. So we've added a couple slides into the voter and parent survey to reflect a couple points, the student perspective. And I just want to highlight that the Walton Family Foundation has been working with Gallup over the past couple of years on really asking Gen Z what their experiences are like in school, and on a number of other issues. But we're going to drop in some of the education stats that we've learned. And so I think one thing that's kind of interesting about what you were just talking about is, reading and math, right? Everyone's saying they're not doing well. Well, students are sort of reflecting that a little bit, right? They're saying they're feeling less interested and challenged in school. Only less than half saying they feel positively challenged by their schoolwork. And what's notable about that is that it's actually dropping. And so it's gone down about 8 percentage points over the last year. And so in addition to the fact that voters are pessimistic and parents are pessimistic, students are also saying, look, we are just not having these challenging, engaging experiences that are meaningful to our education. So something of note.
Yeah. And then Brian, you want to talk about, pass this down here, my good Democratic friend?
So we know the problem. What do people want? So I think, first off, people are out for pretty big changes. 43% are saying we need to make bold changes and adopt new ways of doing things. That makes sense. If most people think that kids aren't reading, kids aren't able to do math, then people are open for some pretty big changes and fundamental ways of reworking. Only 8% say modest changes. Almost nobody says minor changes. So very few people want the status quo. That is not where voters are. They want schools to change.
And quickly, before you move on, Brian, can you go back to 2022? How has that stayed the same, evolved?
Oh, yeah, it's been pretty consistent. Yeah, that's a good point. We have above there the trend line data, and even in the midst of the pandemic, when people were, we really felt this appetite for change. That hasn't gone away. This frustration with what's gone on in schools hasn't gone away just because parents aren't sitting there on Zooms with their kids all day long.
I also think, just along those lines, not to jump in again, but we are in a, as we all just saw with the election last week, we are in a political environment and a issue landscape and an economic landscape that's essentially wrong track, right? So if you're an education advocate, if you're a choice advocate, if you're a curriculum advocate, whatever wherever you stand in wanting reform and change, numbers like this demonstrate over and over again that voters and parents are looking for, again, not just incremental shifts or reforms, but big changes.
So what are those changes? I mean, some of these don't feel that bold. So why are they bold? Because voters think we're not doing these things, and we need to have the boldness to get back to the fundamentals, basically. So the number one change that voters and parents want to see is make sure every child is on track in reading, math, and writing. We'll come back to that, but I think that if the solution you are proposing has no effect on that, we should rethink of how voters are going to react to that. And this will have a messaging framing importance, too, of what are you talking about? Well, the outcome should be these improvements in these core fundamentals. The other one that really goes in that category is career education and real-world learning opportunities. We've seen time and time again, most voters didn't go to college. Most kids won't go to college, right, statistically. And so where is the path for those kids, and not just making people think that all we care about is if you're going to college, and if not, we're kind of done with you in the education system. That's really important to voters and to parents. And that's true, by the way, among voters with a college degree and voters without it. That's not just a blue-collar thing. That's for everybody. Teacher shortages, more teachers, that's what really goes in the funding, and then safety and mental health, important. So these are the top 5, and we'll show you the list. There are a lot more things here, but these are really the big 5 to voters. So these fundamental subjects, and then some of the safety and mental health is also really important to people. Some of these are slightly down the list. A few are interesting for parents that I will kind of call out. This one about redesigning high school to make learning more relevant to student and increase access to work-based learning. That really goes, again, with the career pathways. That goes with some of the tech options that we'll talk about later, some of the AI stuff. There really is an appetite for making sure schools are relevant in the modern era to be able to both compete as a country and give kids a chance at these 21st century jobs.
The only thing I'd add to that is just because they're low on this list, on this page, does not mean that they're not supported by voters or parents. I mean, and we have other data on that Brian will show here in a few minutes. But, I mean, even one of the stuff down there on choice, some of the stuff on phone-free schools, there's a lot in here. Just because they're not at the top of the list does not mean that these are not things that are strongly supported by voters in terms of reform or change. It's just, again, you look at that early data on the fact that most people, 60% or higher of voters and parents, they just don't think that kids are at grade level in math or reading. I mean, that's kind of like, we got to get that solved first, number one, before you can start moving to some of these other things. But there's still very strong support for a lot of the stuff that you see on this slide among both voters and parents.
Agreed. So, for example, if you were talking about something like longer school days, what's the point? It's so that kids can read and write better.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about the future workforce. So as we saw, a really important issue to voters. This is, it's hard to find an issue that voters agree on these days. But, is the sky blue or green, right? It might be a 50-50 question, depending on who's saying what in the day. This sort of stands outside of that people feel like schools are not preparing kids for the modern workforce. 80% of voters, 80% of parents, they're not ready for the world. They're not getting the career guidance they need, and they're not being prepared for the digital economy. So there is a problem here that schools are not meeting, which makes sense. If most voters think that kids are not able to do reading and math effectively, then for sure this is like step 2 past those fundamentals. They definitely don't think kids are ready for this, and they think this is really important. We saw from the earlier slide. Again, similar question. Go ahead. Sorry, I thought you wanted to say something. Similar question that only 10% of people think that that kids are very qualified for these advanced fields, right? Semiconductor, computer chip, quantum computing, 5G and 6G, like these sort of specific areas. They don't think kids are being prepared for these things, which they do think are really important, is having our students and our country be ready for these technologies.
Yeah, and I'll chime in with the student perspective on this, which once again, sort of jives with what we're seeing at the parent and voter level. And I think, obviously STEM was one of the very strong elements in what Brian was just talking about. And we see that, 75% of students, if you look at that bottom red text there, say they're interested in STEM as an occupation, but less than 50% are getting that in school. Right? And so there's a disconnect there. Add to the fact that, just those of you who are tracking this issue, there's estimated to be a huge shortage in STEM fields in the future. So what are we doing to prepare these students? Right now, students themselves are telling us they're not getting what they need to be prepared for those types of careers.
Again, it's important. It's really important to people. So 60% of parents, 60% of voters are saying it is very important to prepare kids for STEM fields. Why? It's about the kids. And I think that there are other arguments, right? There are these arguments of we got to be competitive with China. We've got to be not reliant on foreign workers. We've got to be, right? But really what this is about is the kids, what's best for them, to voters. This is the most important thing, and getting them ready for these jobs. People sort of understand this is where the world is going. They look back at where the world was when they were kids and where the world is now. They see the trajectory, and they see this as a really important thing that schools ought to be, this ought to be right up there with the core subjects as far as what schools are doing in this world, what their role is in society. Mental health, particularly among parents, is important. I mean, I think, especially coming out of the pandemic, right? I think you hear a lot of this still, and I think this comes up even in a focus group. I do focus groups all the time, and you hear parents talk about mental health of their kids, and it really kind of has never come back for them. That's one of the lasting impacts for them of the pandemic.
This is something that, I don't know if you agree, Brian, or not, but this is something like 10 years ago we never would have heard openly in a focus group or when we do qualitative research with parents or voters. I think this is right out of the pandemic. It is, and it doesn't. I mean, here we are now, at least a couple of years out of it, and this is still a top concern among parents, and certainly a top concern as you're going to walk through, I think, Catherine, with the Gen Z. This is not going away anytime soon. So, there's a lot of back to basic type stuff that parents and voters are looking for in terms of getting back on grade level, looking at let's do some things differently, let's get kids ready for future jobs. But some of this stuff is this is big, bold change here, mental health, I think.
Yeah, and we talked, it was in the top 5 of that list of priorities, ahead of a lot of things that we would think.
Yep.
Yeah.
And once again, I feel like a broken record, but not only are parents and voters concerned about it, right? But what do students themselves say? Only 51% say they're thriving in their life. Only 2 in 10 rate their mental health as excellent, right? So 21%. And it's the lowest across all generations, right? So you can see there like millennials, Gen X, boomers, all rating their mental health as excellent at much higher rates than Gen Z. So, not only are voters saying and parents saying, we need to do something in our schools, we need to address this crisis, students are telling us that they're feeling that. And I don't think this is really a surprise to anyone in this room, but certainly confirmation of the moment we find ourselves in and the seriousness of the moment we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and the seriousness of which voters take it, which is not always the case, right? There are a lot of issues that we all know are really important, and voters are like, yeah, whatever, right? I'm focused, but this matters to them. Right. Wanted to talk about AI a little bit in terms of the tech piece in particular. I would say this is an issue where on most of the things you've seen, voters and parents and teachers and students have been pretty aligned. This is an issue where if you have experience in the classroom, you're a little bit ahead of the game. I think that's because you're seeing it in the classroom, right? And so when you're asking, this is a poll of teachers, students, undergrads, and parents, and most of them are seeing the impact of AI in a really positive way in the classroom. A majority among all these groups, or a plurality among teachers, pretty close to a majority, are seeing positive impact, and very few are seeing a negative impact in the classroom. This is a poll in May of 2024, and we did a poll in 2023, and man, the world changes on this one real quick, right? Which is not necessarily the case on reading scores or how people think about that.
And I think too, I've done a lot of work on AI on the business side, and where just general American attitudes are on it. And it's certainly not this positive. There's a lot of concerns about AI, what it's going to mean for safety and security and privacy, loss of jobs, all these other things. But so when you see these numbers about the positive impact that's happening in classrooms and in education, I think that's a positive impact. It's a reassuring sign that these tools are being used effectively right now in the classroom, or at least that's the feedback that we're getting from teachers and students and parents. Who's doing this one? I'll start.
You start.
I'll start. Okay. 2021 Virginia governor's race, education was a big issue. 22 midterms, we did education. We did the similar thing over Salt Lake City, I think. It was an election that was essentially pretty mixed on it. Today, when you ask folks, which party do you trust more on handling of K through 12 education, Democrats have a little bit more of a modest advantage than they did a couple years ago. Now, that being said, as Brian can attest to, my Democratic pollster friend on this panel, it used to be a lot worse for Republicans. Democrats used to have 20, 30-point advantages on education, depending on the state or nationally or things like that. So there's been some ground kind of made back up by Democrats on the issue of education, but certainly not fully regained all that trust, I think, since COVID.
Yeah, Democrats dug themselves into a deep hole during the pandemic by keeping the schools closed, and it's coming back. I mean, give it 2 years, It'll probably be back to where it was. But yeah, I think this is relevant too, and I think in a presidential election, which we're just coming out of, people are pretty locked into what they're doing, although not always. For example, we worked for the Democrat running for governor of North Carolina. He won by 15 points when Trump was also winning the state by 4. There were some Senate races that went one way for the Senate and another way for the president. But for the most part, people are pretty locked in the presidential election. There are not a lot of swing voters, right? This thing is decided by 1 or 2%. That's not the case for how people vote down the ballot and how people think about offices. And 40% of people are telling us that they have crossed party lines because of education as an issue. And that's, by the way, not all. You saw Democrats have an advantage. That's not all just Republicans and independents who say, well, normally I vote for a Republican, but the Democrat's good on this. That's 36% of Democrats who have left their party over an education issue, and even higher among parents, almost half of them. So this is a real issue that, especially in state and local elections, a little less so in federal, people will vote on this issue. They'll change what they normally do based on this issue.
I mean, there's few issues these days now, especially for parents, which you can go back to the next slide, that's fine. Where parents, I mean, this is essentially saying in this data, look, people will cross over.
Yeah.
Including, surprisingly, a majority of Republicans, Democrats, independent voters, but parents. I do think that, look, when you look at the context, contours of the election that was just run, a lot of it was based on the economy, inflation, rising costs. Basically, personal pocketbook issues. What's most personal? What do I deal with every week? I deal with going to the grocery store. I deal with filling up my car with gas. I deal with paying the bills, these things. The next most personal issue to a lot of parents out there in particular is schools and education. And so it's an issue that has more personal relevance to families than a lot of other issues. Crime, immigration, abortion, all these other big hot-button issues, they really aren't, let's be honest, dealt with on a day-to-day basis by most families or parents across the country like the issue of education is.
Well, and I think the other thing is it's not, there's not Republicans care about reading and Democrats care about math.
Correct.
Or,
right.
One side cares about schools and career training. It's like when you ask voters, they don't really say this is a Republican thing or a Democratic thing, unlike abortion or guns,
right.
or all these other issues out there that are very politically coded. So there's a real opportunity for you not to have to sound like a Democrat or a Republican when you're talking about this thing, and just sound like a parent, sound like a regular person. So that's always helpful. So what are the takeaways, right? We have people saying that things are not going well. Like, things are not good in reading, things are not good in math for students. Parents get it, students get it, everybody gets it. There is a problem in the education system, and because of that, there is an appetite for doing things differently. Not just for difference sake, right? They don't just want to change structures, and they're not really focused on, the nitty-gritty of the policy, but they are open to something that will be a pretty big change, as long as that is getting these things done: reading, math, career education, and real-world learning opportunities. Democrats have taken back an advantage on education as COVID has receded, but I don't think that's locked in. It's certainly locked in a particular election. There's no reason a Republican can't win this issue, or a Democrat can't win it by 40 or whatever, right, if they're talking about it the right way, because voters are willing to cross party lines, and they are not looking for Democratic or Republican orthodoxy on this issue.
Well, and you got in less than 2 years now, we'll have more than a third of the state's governor's races are open, right? You're going to have at least 16 new governors, maybe more now with the Trump appointments in a couple states. And governor's races, state legislative races take on, even though they're subject and not immune, right, to the national political moments of what's going on. Voters generally vote more on local issues: education, taxes and spending, the economy in states. So, just ask Terry McAuliffe how important, right, education can be. And so it's going to be an interesting next couple years to kind of watch what happens here with this issue politically, I think, from voters and parents.
All right. Well, thank you both for walking us through that. For those that are interested, just plug that on the left there is a QR code. They'll get you to a memo summarizing what you just saw. So if you want to snag that for future reading. And then on the right is also a link to the Next Gen Insights Hub, which is an amalgamation of so much good research on what today's generation is saying about a number of issues, and particularly education. So take a minute to check both those out. We're going to do questions. I understand that, want to make sure we have enough time for audience questions. So be thinking if you've got a question, we'll do a lineup situation at the mic. But while you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to kick off with a couple up here. And I would love for you guys to go back to, looking at this research, right? There seems to be this discrepancy between what voters say are the biggest problems in K through 12 education and what they want the solutions to be. And what I mean by that is, when you look at the problems, they were saying that funding really topped the list. But then when you looked at what they thought the biggest changes were going to be, it wasn't more funding, right? The answer was ensuring kids are on track in reading, writing, and math. So talk to us a little bit about how you guys are interpreting that and what that might mean for the work.
I mean, I'll just start briefly on that. I think funding to voters and parents is kind of nebulous. Is it $2 billion in funding or $3 billion? What's the difference between 2 and 3? Is it, does X school district need $14 million for a budget, or do they need 16? So I think funding just seems to be the answer. A lot of people, we need more money, we need more money, we need more money. And that's kind of the crutch I think a lot of voters and parents fall on when it comes to hey, what do schools need? I think also just, again, given this has been the case for a long time, but given the economic climate we are in today, I think everyone thinks everybody needs more money at this point, given just the cost and inflation and pricing that's happened. I think the reason they point to math and getting these kids on grade levels, because I think, as you saw in that data, even though there's this sense that most parents seem to think their kids are doing okay, I think there's an understanding that most are not. And that should be kind of rule number one for a school. It's that's what you need to accomplish before you get to do anything else. Is like you need to get your kids at the right spot. I also think that demonstrates what we've seen for a long time in polling on both the right and the left is the importance of testing and to create accountability. The misnomer of why, because I know this will be a question that comes up of like, well, why do parents think that kids are doing better than maybe they are? Mm-hmm. And I think, look, there's always, my kid does great, he's the best athlete, he's the best at this or whatever. But just from going back a long time doing qualitative research on this subject, I don't think parents fully understand what the hell these test scores mean. And this has been going on a long time. I think there's a sense that they get the chapter tests, right, the end of the unit tests back, and the kids do okay. But what's really a lot of the stuff's graded on are kind of those end of the year standardized achievement tests. And I always hear in focus groups, parents never understand what that means. When they get the results, usually like really late, how the results are used to change what happens in the classroom, how the results are used to adapt how your child's learning is going to take place. And so I do think in some ways there's like even just a bit of a communications gap between how we do these great tests, but then nobody really knows what the hell they're for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think going back to your funding point, it's funding for what? Right? Like if you said I put $1 billion more into education, people are like, that's great. And it gives you maybe some sense of a governor's priority and a legislator if they're cutting or funding education, maybe they care about it. But if you're talking about adding a literacy program, adding a shop class at your school, right? Adding a technology hub, like what are those tangible things that you're actually getting out of it that are going to help those outcomes? Like that's what voters want. They want to know, like if the actual answer is we're spending a bunch more funding on bureaucracy levels, well, they don't want that, right? So what that money is for and talking about the outcome is really important.
Yeah. You sort of hijacked one of my questions,
Sorry.
Robert. It's okay. It's great, which was on parents being overconfident in their scores. But one of the things you guys also flagged that's on that list of challenges is parent involvement. And so do you guys think there's a connection between the fact that parents are, voters are saying parents are not that involved, and yet parents are saying, my kids are doing great, they're all above grade level. I mean, those stats do not match with like what we're seeing in NAEP scores. What's going on there?
I think, so parents think parents are involved, and they certainly think they're involved in their own kids' education, right? And I think when non-parents are thinking about it, they're thinking about society broadly and parental involvement and, depending on where you're at, like the decline of the two-family household or all these sort of like big societal things, whereas when you're getting that question as a parent, you're thinking, am I engaged in my kid's education? And most are saying yes, right? And so I think that the gap is, in some of the other surveys we've done, is it's less that parents are sort of confident that their kid is in this place. Like, I know my kid is 1.5 grades above their grade level in reading. They are just like, I think things are going pretty well. I see them improving. I see them better at math and better at reading than they were last year. And what do I know to judge? These test scores, they don't necessarily give me the information I want. So I think some of it is parents having a really tough time knowing where their kid is and hoping things are going well.
Yeah. All right. Let's jump over to school choice. So school choice rated a little bit lower on the priority list.
Yep.
But obviously you guys, are some of the people who've done this polling, right? Generally it polls pretty high in terms of general support. So why would school choice support hover, always north of 65%, sometimes as high as 80%, depending on the poll? And then when you ask voters, hey, what do you think is going to change things? What do you think is going to have a big impact on fixing some of these challenges? It's not very high on the list.
Well, I think, number one, I think it gets boxed out by the fact that the schools their kids are in now are not performing up to snuff. Even not to go back to the election, but we just had an election. I mean, there were a lot of important issues that people were cared about: immigration and abortion and crime and foreign affairs. A lot of issues that were important to people that people wanted supported reform or change on got completely boxed out by the fact that most people can't afford to go to the grocery store. I mean, just simple stuff like that. And so I think part of the reason why it fell down kind of that list, because there were a lot of things on there that were very supported, were strongly supported across the board, like school choice in general, just because I think there's more important right now priorities that voters and particularly parents are looking for that are not being done in schools.
Do you think some of it was because, like, one of the top ones was the top one, right? Was ensuring everybody's on track in reading, and writing, and math, and is it because that is just way more important than the mechanism?
Yeah.
Right? Like, choice is maybe a mechanism, but the ultimate outcome is at the top.
Look at the ones that tested toward the bottom. I mean, it's the choice. It was more technological advancements in schools. It's the tactics.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. People, I mean, I used to work for Rahm Emanuel, who was a big advocate of school choice, and would always say, nobody cares, charter school, private school, public school, they want a good school for their kid. And if any of us had the choice of 5 bad schools we could choose from or 1 good one, but I had to go there, you'd want the good school, right? And so I think people are for it, people support school choice, but if it has to be a mechanism to them that gets them to those other outcomes. So when you're talking to them, is not the benefits of school choice and isn't it nice to have choices and we should have all these different structures and here's how a charter school works and it's different. No, it is about these schools are improving reading outcomes, and if you take them away, then kids are going to do worse, or if you expand them, kids are going to do better. Like, that is the argument you need to have, is about those kids and about those fundamentals.
Yeah. All right, we'll take some audience questions. I'm going to ask one more, so feel free to go to the mic if you've got a question you'd like to ask. But as we're transitioning to that, can you guys talk about what are the most critical factors for advocates and policymakers in this room? Like, if you could say, like, here's what you should leave this room with, here's what you should take home with you from this information in terms of the work we're doing, what would your advice be? Brian and then Robert.
I would go back to that, making sure your conversation is about outcome for kids. I mean, you have, again, a majority of Americans and a majority of parents saying that kids are not able to read or do math at the appropriate level. That is a crisis. Like, that is a disaster. And by the way, they're right? Like, they're right. So every conversation that you can have that meets them where they are, that they understand that fundamental problem and that we're making steps to fix it, whatever the particular solution is, they might not be able to get in depth on what that solution is and how it's going to work. But if you were having a conversation about fixing that major problem and the workforce stuff, you're in a really good place.
I would just add, right now, there's probably never been a better time to be for reform. I mean, that's a huge, you should head home today or tomorrow whenever you head out of here and be very excited that everybody wants change. Everybody wants reform. The status quo is broken. Obviously, everyone's going to have to figure out what the hell that means and we agree to what the change and reforms are. But it's a very different situation when we pull on other issues and everybody's like, things are going pretty good and I don't really want change. And you got a client that's like, well, we want to do, it's like, well, there's not an appetite there for it. There's an appetite. Even coming out of whether you're a Trump fan or not Trump fan, it's like what's coming out of probably D.C. now in terms of maybe sending more money back to the states in terms of education, maybe a very strong pro-choice, school choice, not pro-choice, school choice issue set coming out of D.C. I mean, there should be a lot of excitement about that. I think the one thing I'd also say is communicate. I mean, it's even like we were talking about with test scores, what they mean. And make it simple for people to understand. Most of your constituents are parents and kids. They're just trying to read, do math, be prepared for the future, get a good job, and they're open to lots of different ways of bold changes and different ways of doing it. But you just got to meet them kind of where they are and keep it kid-centric, as Brian said, which is dead on.
All right, let's go to some audience Q&A.
Is this on? Okay, there you go. Hot mic now. Hi, my name is Matthew Teeter. I'm a principal in Salt Lake City School District. So I was wondering if you could, well, first of all, your 2 QR codes are not working.
They're not working? Oh.
They are working now? Okay. Paywall? Oh, okay. You have to pay to get in? Okay. That sounds good. I was wondering if you could dig into the methodology of the parent and voter poll, of whether those were two different sets or it's the same set. Is it parent and voter, or was it parent and voter in terms of the methodology? And then also, as the voters or parents were kind of giving you data, was it translated into different languages? Did you get data in terms of the identity of the parents, in terms of like SES, location, immigrant status, and those types of things, whether they're parents of like students with disabilities or parents of multi-language learners, all those types of things? Because I always kind of interrogate, are we hearing from the native English-speaking, white, upper-middle-class parents in a disproportionate ratio where 55% of our students in regular public education are now students of color, 40% are Title I, that type of thing. So if you could just dig into that and explain the methodology.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a traditional national survey of registered voters, and then we did what you would call an oversample, because obviously there are some registered voters who are parents, and so then we did enough interviews to get up to, I think we had, 1,200 in this survey. This, in terms of the methodology, this reflects a representative sample of what the voting electorate looks like, as well as what the parent electorate, if you will, looks like out there. We did not get into, just for sake of time on the survey, and there was a lot of stuff we tested, we did not get into a lot of demographic questions outside of, among parents we asked, what grade levels I think are your kids in, and do they go to a public school or private school or a charter school? But we didn't get into a lot of specifics on the kids themselves. And frankly, the times we've done that in the past, we find sometimes that's a little more challenging. Some parents, in particular, don't feel comfortable sharing that kind of stuff with pollsters. So even though the ethnicity breakdowns and education breakdowns and income breakdowns are all what you would expect in a representative sample, no idea what our percentage of the poll would have had kids with disabilities or kids with an IEP or different things like that.
And to be clear, this is a survey of parent voters.
Yes.
So non-citizen parents, non-voting parents are not included in this because we're looking at the intersection of electoral policy, but yes, it was balanced on racial, income, education lines,
partisanship,
and what I would say in general is what we saw in this poll. We didn't go through a lot of those slides because just for time, but the lack of demographic divides are pretty striking in terms of, again, Democrat, Republican, white, black, Latino, men, women. Like, what people want for their kids is pretty similar, and that is not true of a lot of other things, right? But, like, what people want for their kids and ability to read and ability to be prepared for a job, like, all of us actually start from a pretty foundational place of wanting a better life for our kids, right? We don't know what that is. It's scary to figure out what that is as a parent, but, like, that is the lack of demographic divides were pretty striking.
I think it's actually a really important point, too, on that, which is if we were at the abortion conference and we were presenting data on abortion attitudes, you'd probably have to have two different rooms to sit there and present the data. Or if we were on an immigration conference or a climate change conference or other issues. But on education, I think to Brian's point, when you go through the crosstabs, really not a significant difference between how voters feel on a lot of these topics.
Awesome. We'll go to the next question, but as we do that, the QR codes have been fixed. So if you tried earlier and couldn't get it, give it another shot. I apologize for that.
Good morning. I'm Shelley Hughes with the Alaska Senate. Appreciate all the data. The title of this session was Leveraging the Public Opinion, so I kind of want to go there. And just as you said, it's very bipartisan as far as when you tease it out. EdChoice had a survey from April 2024 showing, for instance, education scholarship accounts, for school choice, 77% of Democrats, 74% Republicans, 84% overall in support of that kind of thing. So the data is clear. Parents, want reforms, and you were saying this is the perfect time for reform. The problem in our state is that NEA has such a tight grip, and it's not just on Democrats, it's on Republicans who serve in the legislature. And so we try to present the public data, the opinion, and get this information, but we cannot seem to break that stronghold. And part of what they do is they leverage the public, so they get all these talking points out to all these teachers and parents, and our inboxes are just flooded with hundreds and hundreds of emails saying they don't want this, presenting NEA's opinion. We have not been able to figure out how to strategize and actually leverage public opinion as to what parents really want. So I know it has to do with general communication, but do you have any particular strategies that can help us overcome that, or any particular groups? Because what we need is as many emails, or more emails basically, and phone calls coming in from parents who understand we have things to fix. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly start on that. I mean, I think that's an important point. I think that happens across a lot of different issues a lot of times, which is the public is for something, but that's without the mechanisms of a campaign. You can beat back public opinion. I mean, I'll get one example, controversial or not, but I'll go there anyway, is on gun control. You know, every time there's a gun issue or something that happens, there's, you know, Washington, D.C. gets flooded, right, with lots of calls about doing something. And then, you know, groups like the NRA and others come in and lobby and push and advocate against it. I think we've seen this over the last few cycles when there's been the goal of trying to do education reform. We saw this a lot in New York City back in the day. I believe in Chicago, too. Brian is from Chicago. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But you have to run a campaign. And so running a campaign means you need to have resources and funding. You have to go and acquire those emails, like you said. You have to go to the parents and voters and create a grassroots network that can counter that, because you have to run a campaign is basically the only thing I can say here.
Yeah, I mean, people like teachers, you know,
yeah.
they're trusted. And obviously, like, if you ask people just a generic question, who do you believe, a teacher or a politician? Well, like, you know, like, people like us aren't very trusted, right? So it's hard. And I think some of it also, I mean, when people have been successful in getting reforms through over a teachers union's objection, it has tended to, one, you've got to have popular opinion on your side, right? You can't be fighting the teachers and popular opinion. You won't win. And two, you got to have people that are willing to disagree with their teachers unions. Sometimes those are friends, right? We're Democrats. We're friends with the teachers unions. Like, we're pro-labor, right? That is like a core tenet of the Democratic Party. I don't think that's misaligned with school choice. But you got to have someone who's willing to sort of stand up to their allies, and we had plenty of governors who did this on COVID or whatever else, right? So it's not easy, and I sympathize, and they're always going to have that advantage of, like, if your kid's teacher is saying this is bad for their education,
right,
that's a really trusted messenger, and that's hard to combat.
And that's back on the campaign. You also need messengers in a campaign. I mean, you know, anytime as a Republican, we're usually the ones working against those kinds of evil issues that Brian and Democrats put out all the time, right? And so we basically, our job is to go find messengers like teachers that would actually kind of stem the tide a little bit.
Yep.
I do think, though, compared to where we were before, it is getting a little easier to find those people. But you got to go run a campaign, because the other side they'll be ready to roll for sure.
As someone who gets to work in the advocacy side of this and try and make some of these things happen from time to time, I would just add to what you guys are saying that one of the things that I think is really hard is, you know, we've got to get a lot more strategic when we are trying to, like, influence legislators. So one of the mistakes I see groups make is they try and convince the entire state to show up and show out for something, and you don't actually need the entire state to do it. You need to be really strategic about which districts you're in. You need to be really strategic about activating people in those districts. So yeah, it does require money, but resources, I know, are always limited. Many people working in nonprofits here, and so getting really hyper focused on, like, what's it going to take to move the needle to get this policy advanced, and, like, which districts do I need to make some noise in, and what other ones can I leave alone? Because there's always legislators who are not going to agree with the reform agenda, and they're a hard no all the time. Don't waste your time. There's always legislators who are going to be on board, right, from day one. They're our people. That's great. You don't need to do a lot. It's the people in the middle, and so I think just getting a lot more focused. And then I think from what these guys are sharing, make sure that when you're talking to those moderate people in the middle who are trying to debate, you know, put it in terms of like, show them this research, show them that people want to see us getting back on track in reading and math, and explain how the policy that you're advocating for can actually do that, right? You've got to connect the dots for people and show them like, hey, voters are saying they want to get back on track reading, writing, and math. Here's how. Charter schools, school choice, science of reading, right? Like add anything on the list, right? Here's how we're going to do that. And so I think it's on us in this room and people who are making the fight every day to figure out how to connect that for legislators and make the case. So anyway, next question.
Good morning. My name is Jalon Webb, and just for context, I'm a teacher in DC Prep in one of the wards that predominantly serves students of color. And so my question was, how can I, as a teacher, implement and address policy gaps that have been created by not necessarily polling the parents of students who are not documented or have recently come into this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. And I think we just don't have a lot of research, and I don't want to make something up that is not accurate for you. It's a hard group to poll, right? I think for many reasons we've tried to do polls of the undocumented population for different things. There's fear of talking to someone that they don't know, right? And I think one of the problems that we'll go back to the earlier conversation is it's pretty easy comparatively to fire up a high-income suburban parent that is like, got the time and all that. So and those people tend to be more likely to have their kid in a public school, right? And they like their public school a lot, and so that's a voice for often that the teacher unions can get activated. It's a lot harder to activate exactly the group you're talking about that isn't working a 9 to 5 necessarily. I don't have a great answer for that. I think I wish I did, but I think one thing we see about people across the income spectrum, at least, and that work different jobs, than just a white-collar sector jobs, is one of the things that tends to be even more important for those voters is these tangible work skills. Is right, like the idea that if you are pushing my child into one track or another and not giving them options, that's really tough, right? But having all these tangible options, college, career track, et cetera, tends to be even more important for voters in cities, voters across socioeconomic lines. That's one thing that I hopefully can be some helpful advice. And probably also, you're in D.C., I used to live in D.C., immigrant groups, there's a lot of different groups, and each come with their different cultures and come from their different places, right? And so what might work for a Salvadorian voter isn't going to work for, a different voter. So, yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is that, I realize, not always tangible to do because teachers have a lot on their plates, but also teachers have a voice, right, for the students you serve and their families where they might be afraid to speak out. I think raising your voice in rooms like this and in rooms with legislators and electeds can make a really big difference because there is a difficulty in reaching and hearing that perspective. And so sometimes being the connector to that vantage point, I think, can be really, really valuable. So, yeah, next question.
Steve Roberts from Kansas, former State Board of Education member. Now I'm a teacher. Do you have data from either parents or voters about their feelings about using property taxes to fund our schools, or whether or not the money should follow the student, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a great question. We have seen, I think it's safe to say, a significant growth in the percentage of Americans, and when I mean Americans, I mean voters and parents, that money should be following the student. Now, it goes back to the question that was said earlier. Just because the polling, supports that theory, does not mean that it's something that's going to happen, overnight. There's obviously going to be significant pushback. I do a lot of work in Kentucky, where Kentucky, they just had, I did not work on this ballot issue, but this ballot issue just got destroyed, basically by the teachers and the teachers unions in the state that would have done ESAs and choice and vouchers and all these things as part of the money kind of following the student. There's been, I know, pilot programs, I think, in certain states which have done this. But overall, every data point I've seen is that even Democrats, even folks more left of center are supportive of the idea of the money following the student. But again, when that hits the reality, it goes from being on a piece of paper on a poll to, okay, here's a policy we're going to debate. That's when the challenges start to come out. At least that's my point of view on it.
I think that's right. I think in terms of property taxes funding schools, voters have a pretty good sense of if they're winners or losers in that system, right? And everyone will gripe about high property taxes, right? And in your state, of course, some of the people paying the highest property taxes have been the people that have shifted from voting always Republican to sometimes Republican, right? The Overland Parks of the world, right? But that doesn't mean they're still not annoyed when they get that property tax bill. But I would say in general what we've seen is if you are in a state like mine, Illinois, that has places that look like Overland Park and places that really don't, right? The people that live in the high-income suburbs are like, yeah, this is fine. We pay high property taxes, but we chose to move here.
We feel like we're getting a value.
Exactly, and our school is good. But the people in a failing school district are like, I know what those schools look like on the north side, in the north suburbs. I know they don't look like mine, and I know why, right? And so they are much more looking for a more per student or more equitable, however you want to say it, distribution of money. Is that about following the student? Maybe in some cases, right? But they certainly know. Everyone knows if it's unfair, in which Americans, people are pretty. They're a lot more frustrated about unfairness when that unfairness is not in their corner, right? That's not helping them. Yeah, exactly. They're less morally outraged when they're getting the good deal, right? So.
All right, well, we are a couple minutes shy of needing to wrap here, so I will chime in with a final question. You guys conducted this research in August, I believe. It is now November, and we have survived an election. I'm not sure if that's the right word. We made it through another election. Is there anything about the timing of kind of when you saw those results, when you collected that, do you still feel like everything's valid that we're looking at today? Is there anything that you would change or throw in given the last 2 months? And then sort of part B to that question, what's 2025 going to look like? Where are we headed?
I'll let him be the crystal ball. I would say, no, I don't think there's anything different today than if we polled today versus 2 months ago on policy. If anything, some of this data, I think, reinforced what we kind of saw in the election about just frustration, anger, anxiety, wanting change, not being happy with the status quo. I also think, look, at the end of the day, I mean, this is every poll is a snapshot in time. I mean, this is from about this time. This is what we learned. In a few months, things can change and shift dramatically. What if Trump walks into the White House on January 20th and just, they burn the Department of Education down to the ground? I mean, that's going to change things, right? Then money's going to be going to the states, and then how the states do it. So everything's going to be different and shift and change over time. I think the time we're in right now, I think that the trajectory of attitudes on education are really not all that different from where they were a couple of years ago, where voters are frustrated, parents are frustrated, they're not seeing their kids doing well enough, or the kids in general doing well enough. They don't think schools are well prepared for the future, and what the future brings is still kind of like they're not sure. And I think all that anxiety is part of the reason why we've seen now what happened in the election, but also why we've seen kind of these massive midterm, even election years and election referendum years every year for the last, 20 years. We're going on 20 years of national right direction, wrong track being upside down. I mean, it's the longest sustained period of pessimism in American history. Voters are looking for big changes.
I would just add to that, and I agree with all that. I would say you look at this and voters saying they're unhappy with the status quo. We have now in the last 3 presidential elections had the party in power get thrown out.
Right.
16, 20, and 24, the party in power. That has not happened for 100 years. That has not happened. That was before World War I, the last time that happened. It was like what's his name, that had 2 non-consecutive terms. I don't know, Grover Cleveland. I think it was Grover Cleveland. Anyways, it has been a long time. It has been, and actually out of that period of time was then the progressive reform movement, different progressive than today, but Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, like a whole different, like our politics really changed at that point in time. And I think we are in a similar moment where people are friggin' fed up with what's going on. And if you're not hearing that from them, from this election result, and from the last one, and from the one before that, you got to start listening to them. So that feels like the thing that is here in this poll, and then we saw on Election Day.
It's a great place to end, talking about listening to constituents, hearing what they want, and responding. So thank you both. Thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Robert.